Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to ask, where are the reserves? Alright, let's dive in. This is one of those questions that on the surface looks pretty straightforward, but the more you think about it, the more layers start to peel back. Why don't we often see reserves being held back in tabletop historical wargames? You would think, given that history is full of generals agonising over when and where to commit their reserves, that this should be a really natural part of our hobby. Yet if you spend much time around the gaming table, you will notice exactly what I've described. Most players push everything forwards as quickly as possible. Everybody gets stuck in, and before long the whole table is ablaze with action. Very rarely do you see a battalion or a regiment quietly sitting at the back, patiently waiting for the decisive moment. So what's going on here? Now I think the first and most obvious point is the way rule sets themselves are designed. The vast majority, in my opinion, whether we're talking about big battalion level games like Black Powder or smaller skirmish systems like Chain of Command, they tend to push the action towards the front line. Rules usually reward aggression. You're moving towards the enemy, firing, charging, getting stuck in. And that's where the excitement and the dice rolling happen. If you've got a unit just sat in a rear area doing nothing, then by the mechanics of most games, that unit might as well not exist. It's not generating firepower, it's not affecting morale, and it's not influencing the dice in any way. Reserve in real history had immense psychological and practical value. It gave commanders flexibility, it allowed them to react to enemy manoeuvres, and it meant they could exploit a sudden weakness. But on the tabletop, unless the rules actively model that value, the unit is just idle. And most players don't like idle pieces. This leads to another factor, which is simply the psychology of us, the players. When you've lovingly painted your battalions, based them, carried them to the club, set them up on the table, and you know that you might only have 3 or 4 hours to play, the natural instinct is to use them. It feels wasteful to leave them sitting behind a hill. Now, I think a lot of us subconsciously feel that if we don't push everything into the action, we're not getting the most out of the game. After all, you didn't bring your army along just to watch it sit on the sidelines. The same instinct crops up in board games or computer games too. If you've got pieces or units available, you want them out there on the board, not tucked away waiting for a hypothetical opportunity that might never arrive. Now I think as well, time pressure is another really big one. Most of us are playing on weeknights or at clubs or maybe at a convention, and we've only got a limited window to get the game completed in. If you look at historical battles, the reserves were often committed hours into the fighting. Armies could manoeuvre for days before the final clash. But on the tabletop, we've condensed all of that into a handful of turns. If a battle historically might have lasted 12 hours, we're trying to model it in maybe 3 or 4 hours of gaming. That compresses the tempo enormously. There's very little time for the kind of slow build-up and delayed commitment of forces that you'd see in reality. Because of that compression, players feel compelled to commit everything early. Otherwise they might run out of time before the reserves ever get used. There's also the matter of scenario design. A lot of war games, especially pick-up games or club night encounters, are set up with both sides deployed opposite each other, relatively close to the centre of the table. Once the first turn begins, both players start advancing, shots are exchanging with through and night, the whole thing is one big melee. The scenarios don't always leave much room for a layered battle with a first line, a second line and a reserve in the rear. Unless you're playing on a very large table with lots of depth, the reserves don't really have anywhere to sit. They're already close enough to influence the battle from turn one, so players naturally just throw them straight in. That's not to say that there aren't rule sets that try to address this situation. Some games introduce mechanics where reserves arrive later in the battle, can actually be more powerful. Others give bonuses to fresh units that haven't been worn down. A few even have mechanisms that punish you for overcommitting too early. But these systems are still in the minority, and they're often not the ones most people are playing on a regular basis. It's much more common for a game to simply reward immediate engagement, which nudges players into that all-in mentality. I also think there's a cultural convention in wargaming that I've touched on. Over time, players settle into certain habits about what feels normal. If every game you've ever seen or played has involved both sides charging everything forwards, then that becomes the default expectation. You don't even stop to think, should I hold something back? Because you assume the correct way to play is to throw everything in. It's a bit like how in chess beginners will often try to bring out every piece as soon as possible because it feels like you want all of your assets on the board. Only much later do you realise the subtler art of keeping things in reserve, holding back, creating threats without necessarily using every piece at once. In wargaming, because so many games are casual and about having fun, that kind of subtlety is often bypassed in favour of immediate action. There's another point worth considering, which is the size of the forces we tend to field. Many rule sets, even those designed for larger battles, actually compress the scale quite dramatically. So when we're playing Waterloo or Gettysburg, what's actually on the table might only represent a fraction of the actual forces involved. In reality, a commander might have had 30 or 40 battalions with a whole corps in reserve. On the tabletop, we might be lucky to have 6 or 8 battalions aside. If you then decide to hold 1 or 2 of those in reserve, suddenly you're operating at a massive disadvantage in terms of firepower and board presence. So the small scale of our armies pushes us towards full commitment. The reserve just doesn't scale down well when you're only representing a slice of the actual historical battle. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't players that like to hold reserves, but it requires a very particular mindset. It's not about instant gratification, it's about playing the long game, waiting for your opponent to make a mistake and then exploiting it. That's a very rewarding way to play, but it doesn't always fit with the club night culture of let's get everything on the table and see what happens. When people only have a short time, the patience for carefully timed commitment can fade. And you also need to be very well versed in the rules that you're using to know how and when to use them and not run out of time. I also think the spectacle of wargaming plays a part here. Let's be honest, part of the fun is seeing 2 beautifully painted armies crash into each other. When you've got your models on the table, you want them marching forward, trading volleys, charging, rolling dice. You don't want them lurking off in the side, looking pretty but inactive. It feels more cinematic to have everything engaged. And because many of us are motivated by that spectacle, we nudge ourselves into committing everything right away. So let's try all this together. Why don't we see reserves? Because the rules don't usually reward it, because the time constraints of the hobby compress the tempo of the battle, because the scale of our forces makes holding units back feel like a big disadvantage, because players are psychologically inclined to use what they've painted and brought along, and because the culture of the hobby has, over time, settled into the comfortable convention that you just throw everything into the fight. But it's worth asking at this point, is that a problem? I think that largely depends on what you want out of the game. If your primary goal is simulation, then yes, it's a big problem. Real commanders agonised over reserves. Entire campaigns could turn on whether reserves were committed at the right time or held too long. If you want to capture that flavour of history, then a wargame that never sees reserves used is missing something perhaps. On the other hand, if your goal is entertainment, a good night out with friends and some dice rolling, then maybe it's not really an issue at all. Players get what they came for, which is lots of action and dramatic moments. I mean, that being said, I do think there's room for more exploration here. Imagine a rule set where reserves have genuine weight, where keeping a unit fresh meant it could deliver a decisive charge later on, or a system where committing everything early left you vulnerable to a counterstroke. Those kinds of rules could encourage players to think a bit more like historical commanders. They could make the decision to hold back feel like a real gamble, with both risk and reward, and that in the turn could open up new layers of gameplay to us. At the end of the day though, I think we have to accept that the hobby is a blend of simulation and entertainment. We're not really recreating battles blow by blow. We're playing games inspired by history. That means some aspects of real warfare are going to get lost in translation, and reserves might be one of them. Unless the rules specifically push players to hold back, most of us will happily keep charging everything forward because it feels fun, it looks good on the table, and it makes for a lively evening of gaming. So the next time you're at the club and you see both armies slam into each other with no fault of reserves, don't be too surprised. It's not just the players being reckless, it's the whole structure of the hobby nudging us in that direction. But if you're the kind of player who fancies trying something different, maybe give it a go. Next time you set up a game, deliberately hold back a battalion, wait for your opponent to overextend, see what happens when you commit fresh troops at just the right moment. You might find it adds a whole new flavour to your games. And who knows, maybe if enough of us start experimenting with reserves, designers will take note and build more of that thinking into the rules themselves. Until then though, I suspect most games will continue to follow the pattern. Everything forward, maximum action, and very little patience for units sitting quietly at the back. So what do you think? Do you agree with my observation that reserves are rarely used? Or am I just basing this idea on the games that I play? Do you routinely hold units back in reserve in your games? Or do you favour rules that facilitate this? And if so, what are they? As always, I would love to hear what you think in the comments below. So time for a very quick Workbench update. I'm happy to report that I'm making slow but steady progress with my plastic and metal Uhlans that I mentioned in last week's update. I've been taking my time with these cavalry figures, focusing on getting the horses just right, as I really want these to stand out. It's a meticulous process, but they're shaping up nicely. Despite the time I'm investing, they're still a long way from being fully battle ready. However, as usual, there's a host of little tasks begging for my attention this week that are providing a distraction from painting the cavalry. Most notably, I need to get on with the winterisation, if that's a word, of some hedges that I bought from Debris of War at the replay show last weekend. The quality is excellent, but to fit my current theme they need a good dusting of snow and some frosted effects to truly represent the harsh conditions of this ongoing Retreat from Moscow project. These newly acquired, soon-to-be snow-covered terrain pieces will integrate perfectly with the other scenic elements that Ray and I have been painstakingly building. We've been focusing on creating realistic, frostbitten landscapes to provide a suitably grim backdrop for the campaign, and these hedges will add vital linear cover and visual interest to the playing area. Getting the terrain fully ready is a priority as it sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic narrative of the campaign. Now, last weekend my group Posties Rejects ran a demo game at the replay show, which takes place annually in the Royal Engineers Museum, organised by the Milton Hundreds. This event sees tables displaying the best of the hobby as always, positioned in the galleries surrounded by historical artefacts. We were in the vehicle hall, which, to be fair, was a little bit dim compared to the main gallery, but we were still very busy with visitors all day. I barely got away from our table most of the day, but I was able to snatch just a few moments away, take a few quick photos, and I got a video out later in the day. If you haven't watched it, please do. It's a cracking little show and definitely deserves more attention. If Saturday's show is anything to go by, this is one event that will seems to go from strength to strength, and I hope it does too for many more years. So that's it for this week. As always, please join the conversation in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. Maybe consider becoming a member. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from the channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.